Welcome to Preserving the Pantry, where I talk about everything related to food preserving. I am your host, Kathy Burgett.
Hello and welcome back to the pantry. I am so glad you're here again today. We are going to be continuing our discussion of what I call behind the scenes canning. This isn't an actual canning recipe, but it's a things you need to know about canning before you begin canning. So last episode we talked about headspace in canning, and today I want to talk about canning jars. So you have to have canning jars if you're going to be canning, and many people have shelves full of canning jars that they have used for years. That is my situation as well. Or you can purchase new jars at the store. A few things about canning jars is you can get very small jars, 4-ounce size jars, up to quart-sized jars, and those are all very safe for canning. Now, there are also some very large half-gallon size canning jars that are really nice jars out there, but we have to be really careful about using those for home canning. Currently, they are only approved for canning of apple juice and grape juice, and only in specific recipes that actually are approved for that. Decades ago, there were recipes using half-gallon jars, but those aren't considered safe anymore. So only use those for dry storage if you have them for like rice or beans or flour. They'd make great for that on your pantry shelves. And if you're going to use them for canning, it's only for apple or grape juices on approved recipes that specify that. Canning jars come in two different types. There's a regular mouth jar and a wide mouth jar. And you can use either type of jar for your canning, just depending on what you're putting in there. Sometimes the wide mouth jars are easier to fill and to use than the regular mouth jar. All canning jars have rings on them that will fit the two-piece lids and rings for the sealing process. So some questions come up of what about jars where I buy canned food from the store? Can I use those jars? Well, oftentimes those two-piece lids will not fit on those jars, and so it would be unsafe to can in them. Another thing to consider is when you're canning, one of the worst things that can happen is that you open up your canner when you're done and you have a jar that has cracked or exploded in the canner, whether it be a water bath canner or a pressure canner. That product from that jar is gone. Everything is wasted in that. The other jars in the canner that didn't break are still fine. But it's a mess, and what a waste, and so sad after all the work you put into it. Most jars that came with store-bought food, whether it be spaghetti sauce, mayonnaise, things like that, they're not designed to be repurposed for home canning. They might not have the correct tempering to withstand high temperatures for a long processing time. Also, I talked about that lip size might be smaller or vary from the canning jars that are designed for home canning, and might cause seal failure, and so you might not get a good seal on that. North Central Food Safety Extension Network has said that glass mayonnaise jars are acceptable for use in water bath canning processes, such as in fruit sauces or tomato sauce or jam, but it's not safe for pressure canning. Mayonnaise type jars generally are made from thinner glass, so you should expect more seal failures and jar breakage when reusing them. So you have to ask yourself, is it worth it? I don't know. I've never used those type of jars myself. Another piece of recommendation is that older jars, as jars start to age, the failure rate of those jars might not be adequate. I reuse my jars all the time, but one thing I do is I really inspect those jars before each use. I run my finger around the rim and make certain there's no little nicks or cracks at all, and then I inspect each jar. Some of my older jars that are really old, I only use those for storage of dry goods. I like to put like my dried morel mushrooms out and put them on display, or dried peppers. Beans are great in there, and I use them for more shelf purposes, for pantry purposes, just for my dried goods, than for actual canning. the jars over time just start to wear out. So if you're buying jars at a yard sale or like a Goodwill or a thrift market, really inspect those jars and decide whether it's worth it to use those jars or not. A couple of things to talk about is if you're purchasing brand new jars, they always come with the rings and the lids on them. But are those jars clean and ready to use? Nope, they still need to be washed. So make certain that you fully wash those jars each time with hot, soapy water and rinse them really well. You can put them through your dishwasher, of course, as well. I always wash my jars after I've used them. I store them in the pantry without the lid on, and then I wash them again when I'm ready to use them. You do not need to sterilize your jars unless you are using a recipe that has less than 10 minutes. So for most people, that would only be jams in small jars, and you'd have to be at an elevation below 1,000 feet. Otherwise, you're going to have processing times above 10 minutes, and so then you don't have to sterilize your jars. Just really wash those jars very well before you use them for your canning. Next time we will talk about the actual lids and rings for canning, but hopefully this gives you some good information. Get into your pantry now and check out those empty jars, see which ones are still good, and maybe it's time to get rid of a few of the older jars or put them to work in another capacity. I'll see you next week in the pantry. Bye! Thanks for listening. And be sure to tune in again next week for more episodes of Preserving the Pantry.